Thank you so much, Jessica. All right. I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like we're at revival. I mean, we've had amazing speakers. We've had our spirits uplifted. We've had truth be told, and yet we're not finished yet. I mean, that's what a revival does. It keeps you in your seats all day long. So the good news for all of you is that I've reached the age where I have to go to the bathroom a lot. And so there is a time limit. I just want to say how grateful I am to be in community here with all of you, with the city of Boston, with the state of Massachusetts. I'm a Chicago native, very proud of that. Yes, thank you. And I'm even a commuter to Harvard, where I work. And so I have not often had the occasion to be blessed by so many wonderful people who have put their backs against the wall to hold up this democracy in this wonderful place. And so I'm grateful to be here. I just want to very quickly thank Governor Healy, Congresswoman Presley, Attorney General Campbell, Mayor Wu, to the leaders of Union Methodist and St. Cyprian. I am so grateful for this 54th annual tradition that you continue the legacy of those black women who started and are the occasion for us to be here today. I also want to just say to Dr. Reverend Williams, thank you so much for your leadership. You are an embodiment of what all of us hope for this next generation to lead us to the promised land. And finally, to Crystal Collier, who's helped to organize on the MLK committee, a former student of mine. I was told when I started teaching at the Kennedy School, you never know who you'll be teaching. And so I'm grateful for her leadership. And finally, I have some family here. They're sitting at the head table. If they could all just rise and wave to the crowd. Come on, y'all, don't be shy. Yes, family and extended family. That's important because we don't do this work alone. So I said that this felt a little bit like a revival. And in that spirit, I want us to open our New Testament holy books to the book of Martin. You can find it between Matthew and Mark. And I say that because I will be lifting up verses from Martin Luther King's final book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, with some liberty today, because I think it's important to return to the person who told us what his dream had not become in the final months of his life. And he left us, as Congresswoman Presley mentioned earlier, a bit of a blueprint of what he expected to come. And so we cannot ignore his truth. Let me begin with this. In late 1967, a film crew arrived at King's home, and they were surprised at the lack of security. No fence, no gate, no one standing guard to protect his family. When they asked Dr. King, how could they be so unguarded? Weren't they afraid of someone shooting up the place or bombing it? King replied, I guess every day I live under the threat of death. And I had come to the conclusion that something could happen, but I couldn't allow the possibility to immobilize me. And I think ultimately freedom means fearlessness. In a later verse, he said this. He said, this is the pressing challenge confronting the white liberal. When evil men plot, good men must plan. When evil men burn and bomb, good men must build and bind. When evil men conspire to preserve an unjust status quo, good men must unite to bring about the birth of a society ungirded by justice. Nothing can be more detrimental to the health of America at this time than for liberals to sink into a state of apathy and indifference. This moment, for me, has brought a heavy weight and an unwanted burden. I think that's true for many of us in this room today. We feel it personally. I certainly know that I do. But as we gather here today, our togetherness reminds us that our strength comes from community. Our resilience from knowing we are not alone. Our hope from hearing each other's stories so that we will be inspired. Our courage from telling the truth. and our power from choosing to rise up and to not be afraid. Over the past year, we have all witnessed a full-scale assault on education in America. The assault began in state after state, in K through 12, spread to public colleges and universities, and has now metastasized into private workplace training and breached the gates of private colleges and universities. There is a profound and chilling irony when it comes to universities for those who are leading this assault, for those who claim, and I quote, "There has been a hostile takeover of post-secondary education by political activists, woke faculty, and partisan administrators," in the words of Virginia Fox, who chaired the December 5th congressional hearing on anti-Semitism. She went on to say the college education model should, at its very core, be an open marketplace for all ideas to be heard, free of political bias and agendas. Fox is correct. Universities are marketplaces of ideas, and for most of their histories, white supremacy and colonialism were sold at bargain rates. The marketplace was saturated because there were so few ideas to challenge. How else do we explain Harvard's own history, massive wealth accrued from slavery, indigenous bones and black bodies, dead and alive, used as raw materials for scientific research? And not just Harvard or other elite universities, the Smithsonian likewise was collecting the bodies and brains of the so-called inferior races well into the 20th century. Even the Bronx Zoo, opened to great acclaim at the turn of the 20th century, about the same time my great-grandfather was born in Georgia. Had he been born in New York instead of Georgia, he might have witnessed for himself the teenaged Congolese boy named Odebenga, who'd been kidnapped and stolen from Angola by an anthropologist and encaged in the monkey house at the zoo. When black people came together to say, "Not in our name," and to protest Benga's captivity, the New York Times responded, and I quote, "We do not quite understand all the emotion which others are expressing in this matter. Odebenga, according to our information, is a normal specimen of his race or tribe, with a brain as much developed as are those of its other members. Whether they are held to be illustrations of arrested development and really closer to the anthropoid apes than the other African savages, or whether they are viewed as the degenerate descendants of ordinary Negroes, they are of equal interest to science and can be studied with profit." The Times editorialist went on to conclude, quote, "Pygmies are very low in the human scale, and the suggestion that Benga should be in a school instead of a cage ignores the high probability that school would be a place of torture to him. The idea that men are much alike except as they have had or lacked opportunities for getting an education of books is now far out of date." It took until 1970, from that point in 1903, for black studies to gain a foothold in higher education, another 20 years to establish PhD programs. And right now, to this day, these programs are generally small. Women and gender studies have had a similar trajectory, and indigenous, Asian American, and ethnic studies have barely gotten off the ground in most colleges and universities. Simple math tells us that Harvard's nearly 400-year history has been overwhelmingly a one-sided story, a marketplace dominated by scientific racism. Meritocracy was not and has not been the order of the day. It was privilege and exclusion. If we return back to the book of Martin, he says this: "Generally, we think of white supremacist views as having their origins within unlettered, underprivileged, poorer classes of whites. But the social obstetricians who presided at the birth of racist views in our country were from the aristocracy, rich merchants, influential clergymen, men of medical science, historians and political scientists from some of the leading universities of the nation. Soon the doctrine of white supremacy was embedded in every textbook and preached in practically every pulpit. It became a structural part of the culture." Let me remind you, Dr. King wrote these words 5 years before I was born. It took 20 more years for most universities to begin to make serious efforts to build departments and programs of study that could challenge conventional academic wisdom that women were not inferior in science and math, and that African Americans had lower IQs because of their cognitive inferiority. Remember the bell curve debate by Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein? In the mid-1990s, these ideas were in full bloom when I was in graduate school. As late as 2017, Harvard's math department did not have a single woman among its tenured faculty. A reporter asked me recently, given all the charges of DEI run amok at Harvard, what has the university been doing, really? How would you characterize these efforts, he asked. I told him Harvard's DEI work was about as developed as a toddler just learning how to walk. Nowhere on my campus can you find unqualified people running anything. Just the opposite. Whole categories of lived experiences and professional expertise are missing. I've never attended nor heard of any training that told people they were oppressors because they were white. Nor have I ever heard that the goal of DEI initiatives was to be racist against anyone. The charges of reverse racism coming from elite politicians and billionaire donors is not just laughable. These false claims are a form of the most extreme misinformation and a colossal expression of hypocrisy. If you took all the power of DEI officers on my campus or anywhere else, people who are usually Black, Latinx, Asian American, or white women, and put them in an explosive, you'd have about as much firepower as a firecracker. Maybe a stick of dynamite if they work at Disney. By stark contrast to the Bill Ackmans and his CEO co-conspirators, you're comparing firecrackers to an arsenal of 2,000-pound bombs, like the ones the billionaires are using to explode or destroy countless lives, including hundreds of students' lives, doxing them, plastering their faces on big screens, and blacklisting them from future employment. It is an understatement to say that this isn't a fair contest between equals. Whatever we might say of the excesses of cancel culture on the left, particularly young people, a speaker booed off stage, someone Me Too'd by a swarm of social media activists, the power differential is breathtaking. Remember, Dr. King said in 1967 that white supremacy was embedded in every textbook and preached in practically every pulpit. It was a structural part of the culture. And when you finally have people like me, 50 years later at a university like Harvard, you still have to fight with one hand tied behind your back to diversify the curriculum, to educate people who would otherwise believe the racist lies their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were taught. Can I be candid? Let me illustrate this with a point. 5 years ago, my colleagues and I, some of whom are here, brought an exhibition to the Kennedy School called Undesign the Red Line. The exhibit explored the history of redlining in Boston. It was an explicit presentation on the exclusion of Black people from gaining access to homes in many areas of this city. That's right. You'd figure at the world's leading policy school, this would be a good thing. Half our students come from other countries. Most of our students are not generational victims of structural racism. But all of our students will graduate with the power to make decisions on behalf of other people far less influential than them. If redlining is not a prime example of systemic racism in housing, I don't know what is. Housing is the primary instrument of wealth building in this country. It determines the quality of public education children receive. It predicts which zip codes are the most toxic to live in, which zip codes have healthy, affordable food to eat, which zip codes are used by banks to raise fees on customers and to target borrowers for predatory loans. But I know most of you know all this. What you don't know is that a senior member of the Kennedy School administration refused to allow this history to be described accurately on promotional signs around the building. He objected to naming redlining systemic housing and economic racism. As the senior leader explained to me, calling redlining housing and economic inequality was better because some people might disagree that redlining was racist. As if maybe we just don't know why the housing was unequal, or that maybe blacks were actually to blame for their poor housing conditions. The battle over the truth of naming redlining systemic racism is just as absurd as if the school refused to accurately describe an exhibit about climate change because, quote, some people might not believe that global warming is due to man-made carbon emissions. It's all the more offensive since at the time I was the only black tenured member of the faculty, who also happened to be the only senior faculty member whose expertise is indicated by my job title, Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy. Predictably, I was incredulous. After insisting on the changes, the administrator refused. I lost, we lost, truth lost. And yet, the battle to tell the truth about the past, as I've shown in this story, is not just a problem for Confederate flag wavers, or election deniers, or fascist climate change deniers and anti-vaxxers. As Dr. King himself described, even in areas where liberals have great influence, the situation of the Negro is not much better than areas where they are not dominant. This is why many liberals have fallen into the trap of seeing integration in merely aesthetic terms, where a token number of Negroes adds color to a white-dominated power structure. They say, quote, our union is integrated top to the bottom. We even have one Negro on the executive board. Our neighborhood is making great progress in integrated housing. We now have 2 Negro families. And my favorite, or our university has no problem with integration. We have 1 Negro faculty member and even 1 Negro chairman of a department. Either Dr. King was clairvoyant, as we would say prophetic, or not nearly as much has changed as the truth deniers, liberal or conservative, Northerners or Southerners, would have us believe. I know it even sounds strange that Dr. King would use such woke language as white-dominated power structure. Children, close your ears. How dare he? That sounds like critical race theory, and we all know Dr. King didn't believe in no CRT. After all, the best people able to channel King today to judge his legacy, like former Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy said, quote, critical race theory goes against everything Martin Luther King has ever told us. Don't judge us by the color of our skin, and now they're embracing it. Congressman Josh Mandel of Ohio said, by advancing the lie of critical race theory, the liberals are stomping on the grave of Martin Luther King. And perhaps King's most loyal fan and a true leader embodying King's legacy, Governor Ron DeSantis, said, you think about what MLK stood for. He said he didn't want people judged on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character. All of these are lies and distortions and are designed to induce inaction, apathy, and fear. And all this misinformation is one battlefront in a larger political war, not culture war, political war to destroy the possibility of a fully functioning and just multiracial democracy. But you don't have to take my word for it. Ask Christopher Rufo. As one of the main masterminds behind this movement told Politico recently, my primary object, he said, is to eliminate the DEI bureaucracy in every institution in America and restore truth rather than racialist ideology as the guiding principles of America. In the same interview, Rufo bragged about coordinating a conservative playbook against Harvard that has already been used around the country. I've run the same playbook on critical race theory, on gender ideology, on DEI bureaucracy for the time being, he continued. Given the structure of our institutions, this is a universal strategy that can be applied by the right to most issues. I think we've demonstrated that it can be successful. Rufo is right to point to his prior successes. He is on a winning streak. He invented the anti-CRT movement in the summer of 2020. He made the whole thing up as he proudly boasted on Fox News with the former liar anchor, Tucker Carlson. He said, "It's absolutely astonishing how critical race theory has pervaded every aspect of the federal government, this under the Trump administration. Conservatives need to wake up. This is an existential threat to the United States." Since then, as we've already heard today, 28 states have adopted anti-CRT bans, and thousands of books focusing on Black people or LGBTQIA people as protagonists in these stories have been banned. Several children's books about Dr. King, for example, have been yanked from schools and library shelves. In Williamson County, Tennessee, just to give one example, a local chapter of Moms for Liberty filed a complaint about the second grade curriculum. They wrote, "The narrow and slanted obsession on historical mistakes," it's laughable, "reveals a heavily biased agenda, one that makes children hate their country, each other, and/or themselves." The specific example cited in this material about Martin Luther King and the March on Washington, which was what the book was about, featured an illustration of white firemen blasting Black children to the point of bruising their bodies and ripping off their clothes. Another page showed a photograph of white and colored drinking fountains and asked the young reader, which of these fountains looks nicer to you? The problem isn't bias. The problem is the actual history of violence against Black people who stood up for and said, "Not in our name." In addition to calling for the removal of King's second grade book, Moms for Liberty also wanted to ban 2 books about Ruby Bridges, including an autobiography by Ruby Bridges herself. As far as Moms for Liberty is concerned, your own story, not just someone else's, your story about what actually happened to you is verboten, unspeakable. Rufo can justifiably take credit for a lot of this madness, but most recently he admitted that he's collaborating with Congresswoman Elise, always Trumper, Stefanik, and Dollar Bill Ackman to destroy DEI. Many of you may recall in the summer of 2020, the New York Times released a report on 922 of the most powerful people in America. As the Times described in its own words, these people, quote, "run Hollywood studios and head the most prestigious universities. They own pro sports teams and determine who goes to jail and who goes to war." So you're thinking, okay, all right, out of 922, how many of them were white people? 40%? Come on. No. How about 50%? No. 60%? That sounds about right. 60% of the population, according to the 2020 census, identify as white only. But nope, that's not the percent either. How about 70%? They found that 80% of the most powerful people in America are white. That's just 3 years ago. Where I work at the Harvard Kennedy School, 74% of our faculty and staff identify as white. We just hired the first Black tenured woman in Kennedy School history 3 years ago. We'll take it. Across all of Harvard, Black tenured faculty are only 6% out of 581 total tenured faculty. That's 35 people in the oldest, richest, most powerful, and apparently wokest academic institution in America. When you just stop and take a deep breath, you realize we are living in the land of make-believe. Or as my cousins, August and Sloan, might say, because kids like to play It's Opposite Day, where up is down, right is wrong, lies are truth. But you don't just have to say, accept any of this. Just say not in our name. Let's just revisit what we learned 24 months ago. At the height of the pandemic, COVID deaths showed us the truth about systemic racism, that the last and the least were sent to their deaths to serve the privileged and the insured. During the height of the pandemic, the American Public Health Association issued a report noting that 209 entities in 37 states, from local school boards to municipalities to public health agencies, declared racism a public health crisis. The American Medical Association adopted new guidelines to confront systemic racism in medicine. In the face of the overwhelming evidence that systemic racism put black and brown people in mortal jeopardy because of their overrepresentation in environmentally polluted, redlined neighborhoods, living in overcrowded and overpriced, dilapidated housing, commuting to work on mass transit, poorly paid and underinsured, and yet these folks were on the front lines of battling COVID as the bus drivers and subway contractors, as the grocery store clerks and the orderlies and healthcare workers on the front lines. By the numbers, black and brown people are still facing long odds when it comes to key quality of life indicators, from healthcare to housing, from poverty to policing, from work to wealth. The wealth gap is still 8 to 10-fold. Not much has changed, folks. The only thing that has changed since racism was declared a public health crisis is not that racism is no longer a public health crisis, or even that the national reckoning with the evidence of premature death in black America is not simply the sum total of bad black bodies, bad parenting, and bad behavior. What's changed is that American fascists and neo-Confederates have conspired once again to suppress the vote, outlaw protests, and criminalize the freedom to learn, read, speak the truth, lead institutions, and once again have convinced a huge swath of ordinary white citizens to join them. In the book of Martin, there's a chapter that goes like this. He says, "It would be grossly unfair to admit recognition of a minority of whites who genuinely want authentic equality. Count yourselves among them. Their commitment is real, sincere, and is expressed in 1,000 deeds. But they are balanced at the other end of the pole by the unregenerate segregationists who have declared that democracy is not worth having if it involves equality. The segregationist goal is the total reversal of all reforms, with reestablishment of naked oppression and, if needed be, a native form of fascism. The great majority of Americans," the book of Martin goes on to say, "are suspended between these opposing attitudes. They are uneasy with injustice, but unwilling yet to pay a significant price to eradicate it." King adds, "White Americans left the Negro on the ground and in devastating numbers walked off with the aggressor. It appeared that the white segregationists and the ordinary white citizen had more in common with one another than either had with the Negro. When Negroes looked for the second phase after the legislative achievements of the Civil Rights Movement, the realization of equality, they found that many of their white allies had quietly disappeared." What King calls the realization of equality, that's the phase we've been in very tepidly for the past 3 decades. Baby steps, as I said before, and with a sense of urgency for the past 3 years. It's the same thing that Bill Ackman says is the, quote, E for equity in DEI. Let me go on as I move to close. Dr. King saw in the quick reversals of the civil rights movement a backlash unfolding right before his very eyes. He went on to describe this in Where Do We Go From Here? In the opening pages, he says, quote, "1 year later, some of the people who had been brutalized in Selma and who were present at the Capitol ceremonies were leading marches in the suburbs of Chicago amid a rain of rocks and bottles, among burning automobiles to the thunder of jeering thousands, many of them waving Nazi flags. A year later, some of the Negro leaders who had been present in Selma and at the Capitol ceremonies no longer held office in their organizations. They had been discarded to symbolize a radical change of tactics. A year later, the white backlash had become an emotional electoral issue in California, Maryland, and elsewhere. In several southern states, men long regarded, and I just have to pause on this one, as political clowns, had become governors or only narrowly missed election, their magic achieved with a witch's brew of bigotry, prejudice, half-truths, and whole lies. Straight from my mouth to your ears from Dr. King's Book of Martin. So that's the choice we face at this moment. Who are you going to believe? Dr. King or Dollar Bill Ackman? Me or Christopher Rufo? Because they want you to believe that this is all a woke conspiracy meant to indoctrinate white Americans to hate themselves and their country. This is what we are supposed to believe from the very people who now call the January 6th insurrectionists true patriots. The same people who say it isn't fair that they are called racist when they criticize black people, but turn around and label any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism. The same people who believe in revising history curriculum to show the benefits of slavery for black people, but in the same Florida curriculum write, and I quote, "Explain why it is important for current and future generations to learn from the Holocaust." These are the same people who say, quote, "Diversity is a code word for white genocide," or that anti-racist is a code word for anti-white, and now have labeled anti-racism as has labeled anti-racism and DEI as anti-Semitism, weaponizing black people's historical allies. Yes, our historical allies are the very people who said to Alabama Governor George Wallace, "Not in our name." Said to Birmingham Sheriff Bull Connor, "Not in our name." Said to the countless arsonists and bombers, lynch mobs and domestic terrorists, "Not in our name. Not in our name will you blow up black churches and kill black children and murder with impunity black patriots who fought German Nazis and Italian fascists overseas, only to be murdered in cold blood for wearing proudly their army uniforms. Not in our name." In the December 5th congressional testimony, Virginia Fox said a radical ideology had taken over the universities, a radical ideology, as she singled out my class on the history of race and racism, and I quote, as a prime example of this ideology at work at Harvard. No, Virginia Fox, not in my name. The Anti-Defamation League reminds us that right-wing white supremacists have been responsible for nearly all the devastating acts of violence against Jewish communities as well as other marginalized communities in the United States. Such extremists reportedly have been emboldened by Trump's adoption of specific elements of their rhetoric and his dismissal of their hate, such as his use of the term globalist and migrant caravans, or even his campaign slogan, "America First," and we might add the generous use of vermin to describe his political enemies as of late. People like Elise Stefanik, who have harbored hate in the Republican Party, who have accepted the premises of white replacement theory, are people who are in political kinship with folks like Peyton Gendron, the 18-year-old Buffalo killer of innocent black people at a grocery store, who took credit in his manifesto for the killing. He described his motivation because he was concerned about the future of white people. He asked himself in a fact or an FAQ style back and forth, did or do you personally hate blacks? He said, no, if they live on their own land. But a black man or woman choosing to invade our lands, live on our soil, live on our government support, and attack and replace our people, yes, I dislike them. But he saved his most hate, the Buffalo shooter, for white traitors. He said, the only people I truly hate are the converts, those from our own people that turn their backs on their heritage, turn their backs on their cultures, turn their backs on their traditions, and become blood traitors to their own race. And finally, in a series of self-directed questions, are you a white supremacist? Are you a racist? Are you intolerant? He answered, yes, yes, and yes. Are you a fascist? Yes. Fascism is one of the only political ideologies that will unite whites against the replacers. Since that is what I seek, calling me a fascist would be accurate. And finally, are you an anti-Semite? Yes. And I won't repeat what else he said. 5 years before Gendron killed 10 black people and wounded 2 others, Jews will not replace us was the rallying cry on the campus of the University of Virginia, a rally ignited by the decision to remove the Confederate monument of Robert E. Lee. Gendron stands in a long line of white supremacists, white men who pose the greatest threat of domestic terrorism in the United States, according to FBI data. Not woke, leftist college students. Gendron also said that Dylan Roof, he named, was someone that he looked up to. And as we already know, Roof is responsible for killing 9 black worshipers at Emmanuel AME Church, who also singled out that the problem is that Jews look white and in many cases are white, and yet they see themselves as minorities, just like the N-words. Most Jews are always thinking about the fact that they are Jewish. Dylan Roof. Of course, there was the Tree of Life killer, Robert Bowers, who shouted, all Jews must die. Despite Fox and Stefanik's lies, These are the facts. American Jews and American blacks have a common enemy. The enemy knows if they can control your mind, they can control you, your body, your spirit, your ability to name your struggle and fight. We cannot be afraid because fear is the oxygen that fuels their movement. In 1995, a year after a Newt Gingrich-led Congress passed and Bill Clinton signed into law the largest crime bill in American history, all but ensuring America would reach new heights of exceptionalism for putting more people in cages than any country in the world. Toni Morrison wrote an essay entitled Racism and Fascism, warning about the inextricable link between the two. She wrote that before the final solution, there is a first solution, a second, a third, and so on. She outlined 10 steps, and they are: 1, construct an internal enemy; 2, isolate and demonize that enemy; 3, enlist the media to distribute misinformation and propaganda about the enemy; 4, discredit those who expose the lies about the enemy; 5, silence those who come to the defense of the enemy; 6, malign all representatives and sympathizers with this constructed enemy; 7, promote scientific racism and myths of racial superiority; 8, prepare, budget for, and rationalize the building of holding arenas for the enemy, especially its males and absolutely its children; 9, reward mindless apathy with monumentalized entertainment; and 10, maintain at all costs silence. She ended by saying, in 1995, racism may wear a new dress, buy a new pair of boots, but neither it nor its succubus twin, fascism, is new or can make anything new. It can only reproduce the environment that supports its own health: fear, denial, and an atmosphere in which its victims have lost the will to fight. The forces interested in fascist solutions to national problems are not to be found in one political party or another, because the genius of fascism is that any political structure can host the virus. Virtually any developed country can become a suitable home. Fascism talks ideology, but it is really just marketing for power. Not in our name. We can rise up, we can resist, we can fight back. One of the most profound legacies of Dr. King, the one that makes him more of a ghost haunting this nation than a monument frozen in time on the National Mall, was his ability to face facts fearlessly. In his final book, he wrote, "The racism of today is real, but the democratic spirit that has always faced it is equally real. The value in pulling racism out of its obscurity and stripping it of its rationalizations lies in the confidence that it can be changed. To live with the pretense that racism is a doctrine of a very few is to disarm us of fighting it frontally, as scientifically unsound, morally repugnant, and socially destructive. The prescription for the cure rests with the accurate diagnosis of the disease." How strange it would be, he went on, to condemn a physician who, through persistent work and the ingenuity of his medical skills, discovered cancer in a patient. Would anyone be so ignorant as to say the patient caused the cancer? That the doctor caused the cancer? Through the skills and discipline of direct action, we reveal that there is a dangerous cancer of hatred and racism in our society. We did not cause the cancer, we merely exposed it. Only through this kind of exposure will the cancer ever be cured. The committed white liberal must see the need for powerful antidotes to combat the disease of racism. The enemies of progress, the enemies of equity, the enemies of truth, the enemies of a new world that does not continue to extract the land, the lives, and the labor of black and brown people wherever they are and whatever their religion in the name of safety and religion cannot win. The word decolonization is used as an epithet these days by people who believe a world in which a global minority shall permanently rule over the global majority cannot and will not win, not in our name. And to be clear, there have always been and always will be European-descended people, white people, who are fighting for a new world of truth and justice and an earth that can be healed. We owe it to Dr. King to be truth tellers. Another truth teller, James Baldwin, put it this way: not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. We must be clear-eyed, to be scientific, as he said in our diagnosis. It is in facing the facts squarely that we find the truth, the strength, the resilience, the hope, the courage, the faith, and the power to rise up and to not be afraid. Thank you.